The stigma of those living with mental illness is incredibly damaging. It's still to this day, even 2,500 years after it was discovered, this thing called chemical imbalance in the brain by Hippocrates, who said there's an imbalance. We still, as a society, do not believe, do not act like mental illness is based on a verifiable illness. Hence, whenever you talk about your mental illness, if you talk to 50 people in the room, there's 30 people in the room who are looking, going, wow, you know what? That guy's just got to get it together.
At first, I didn't want to share my story. I was so tired of being treated like a communicable disease rather than a person. I was so tired of the stigma. I just wanted to move on with life, completely disconnected from the events of the past.
Sean Miller was born February 19, 1973 in Morden, a small town in southern Manitoba, Canada. He was the first of 3 boys and the first grandchild of his maternal grandparents. Early on, Sean developed a love and passion for playing music, and in particular, for drumming.
I played in a stage band. I started playing drums in school. Kids would play sports during their lunchtime in the gymnasium, but I would be in the band room practicing drums. I practiced for hours a day. Sometimes I'd practice for 5 hours a day. People thought it was crazy because band was an easy credit. You took that so that you wouldn't have to work that hard at it, but I took it on, and it became a huge passion for me, almost an all-consuming passion.
Sean was an energetic child, by which today's standards may have been diagnosed as a form of ADHD. His boundless energy challenged his mother, so at age 5, a doctor prescribed Sean with Ritalin. After just 2 weeks, his mother stopped giving him the drug because of its negative side effects. As Sean grew older, his hyperactivity naturally subsided and no further treatments were required. Sean's immediate and extended family had a long history of mental health issues. Despite this family history, it appeared Sean did not inherit the same genetic predispositions. He had grown into a healthy young adult who had many friends and was eagerly pursuing making music. In 1996, at age 23, Sean began to experience troubling thoughts he would later describe as having voice-like qualities. These voice-like thoughts made demands and would threaten him if they were not obeyed. He began obsessing over making perfect decisions to avoid what he believed would be deadly consequences. Simple things like choosing where to buy groceries or which route to take home became incredibly difficult, and he began having panic attacks.
I remember one night going to do my banking and hearing, not audibly, but in my head, that I would die if I did my banking that night, which is obviously ridiculous. It's disconnected from reality. But I didn't realize at that point that I was developing a mental illness. I knew something was wrong, but I wasn't sure what. These thoughts seemed foreign to me. They didn't seem like my own thoughts. So I was on a quest now to discover the source. Were they God? Were they the devil? Like, what is going on in my head? I went into this church with a friend of mine, and at this point, my life was so riddled with these thoughts that I just couldn't shut off. I had to determine the source of these voices that I was hearing. I had to figure this out. So I asked myself the question, how many lights are in this room? And I actually got a response. It was 36. So a natural response is to start counting the lights. So I only counted 28, and which dramatically reduced the anxiety momentarily until I heard, "You missed the 8 lining the walls." At this point, the voices became believable, and this dread washed over me. Suddenly, I realized I was having conversations with myself. And because these thoughts were commanding me to do all these things and threatening my life, at one point I heard, if you go do your banking tonight, you're gonna die. So when I got the answer back and it was accurate, I'm like, wow, maybe there's some validity to these conversations I was having with myself.
As the illness progressed, Sean began to experience intense guilt for past wrongs and the voices threatened him with punishment if he did not somehow make amends. Feeling terrorized by their continuous threats and hoping to silence the voices, Sean began to compulsively apologize to anyone he felt he had previously wronged. Instead of feeling relief after obeying their commands, he felt worse, and his fear of impending death grew steadily. It seemed there was nothing he could do to appease the voices and restore peace of mind.
Now this was consuming most of my waking hours and affecting my sleep. Nightmares, if I had any nightmares, I actually considered those to be a reprieve from what I was experiencing while I was wide awake. This was non-stop. My demeanor changed. That calm, cool, collected demeanor kind of was lost, and this haunted look kind of overcame me, and it was wrecking my health. I started to lose weight. My skin tone changed. It was kind of taking on more of an ashen, washed out look. The joy just drained from my life. I could not enjoy playing music, relationships with friends. At work, I was focused on the noise in my head rather than on our clients, on the customers that were coming into the store where I was working.
Sean did not seek medical help because he did not recognize that he was suffering from symptoms of mental illness. However, after 3 months of sleepless nights, racing thoughts, threatening voices, and visions of looming catastrophe, the anxiety finally brought Sean to his breaking point. In December of 1996, his friends brought him to the hospital, and once admitted to the psychiatric unit, his symptoms raged out of control.
So when I arrived at the psych ward, instead of feeling a sense of relief because I was amongst medical professionals, my thoughts, mentally, I became unglued, completely detached from reality. I went into the TV lounge, sat on a couch and started watching TV, trying to ignore the noise in my head, but it shouted all the louder. Get up, stop watching TV, go sit in the kitchen on the floor and start shouting that Jesus Christ is a liar. So this is what was going through my mind the whole time during that incident. And so I did. I got up, I went and I sat on the floor in the kitchen, but I didn't shout out the phrases because I didn't want anybody else to think I was crazy. Which seems strange because I was in a psych ward. I was completely overwhelmed with anxiety at that point. There wasn't a lucid thought in my head. I was so exhausted. I had gone through a whole night without any rest, and I was thinking of getting some sleep, but these voices were saying that now, if you fall asleep, you won't wake up, you're gonna die. So that night I was in the hospital bed and just dealing with non-stop activity mentally.
The voices wanted Sean, who was a lifelong drummer and a passionate musician, to break all the fingers on his left hand.
I was dealing with this noise that I could not shut off. That was in my head, and the voices just constantly commanding me to do things. And at this point, they were saying to me, you need to break the fingers on your left hand or else you'll go to hell. You'll die when you sleep. I erroneously believed that if I complied, I would alleviate that stress, that awful tension that I was feeling. So I complied, and I almost severed the pinky from my hand. My guts were in such a knot that the pain of my broken finger didn't even register.
Despite his duress, Sean managed to hide the injury from hospital staff. It was not until the next morning that Sean alerted healthcare professionals to what he had done. Alarmed, they promptly tended to his self-inflicted injury and placed him on suicide watch in a small, isolated room.
I was shell-shocked to the core. I thought for sure I was doomed now.
Traumatized and confused about what was happening, Sean spent the next 14 days in the psychiatric ward. He was diagnosed with psychosis, given a prescription for an antipsychotic, an antidepressant, an anti-anxiety, a sleep aid, and was discharged home without any follow-up support.
They sent me home 2 weeks later with a handful of medication, and I was left pretty much to figure out life on my own. I didn't want to succumb to that being the norm for the rest of my life. I had things to do, I had goals, I had ambitions, and I wasn't going to stay in this spot that I was put in. I was going to beat this thing. When I came home from the hospital, I looked for some follow-up care. I needed to find a physician, a psychiatrist that would just kind of monitor my progress. I wanted to beat this thing. So I wanted a plan put in place to live beyond the illness. I'd gone through the episode. I wanted to put that behind me, just move on with life. So I did manage to find a psychiatrist, and it was okay at first. You know, there were the checklist questions. How's your mood? How's your appetite? How's your energy? How are you sleeping? So that's great. Necessary questions to ask, but those were the only questions that were asked. And it continued on and on and on. And I started to lose patience. I was tired of the side effects of the medication. I wanted to move on with life. So I started to take matters into my own hands. I stopped going to the appointments. I started taking the medications only when I felt like it. And very shortly thereafter, the symptoms started to return. And 1997, I actually admitted myself to another unit because I wanted to figure out what was going on. I felt very supported there. However, it was more of the same. Based on the survey that you filled out, Mr. Miller, here's what we think is wrong with you, and here are some medications to fix it. But the medications didn't fix it. They simply deal with the symptoms. They did dull the voices, but I was still emotionally flatlined.
Sean seemed to experience a reprieve from the illness after taking himself off medication. It was during this time in 1998 when he met and started dating Doris. He was honest and told her about the illness he had experienced, but she was unfazed, and their relationship quickly developed. Life was looking up again for Sean, and it appeared the horrors of the illness were behind him.
When we were dating, he told me that he had been previously hospitalized. It had been a horrific hospitalization. And, but he said, no, I'm fine now. I'm okay. I don't need these medications anymore. I'm not seeing this doctor anymore. So I thought, well, it was just like a one-time only, thing that happened to somebody. And I thought, all right, he certainly was functioning very well. He had lots of friends. He had a job. He was involved very heavily with music. Like, he just seemed to have a really productive life. And so there didn't seem to be any indication that there was something very serious still brewing beneath all of that.
Doris and Sean were married in the summer of 1999. However, Doris noticed changes in Sean's behavior and mood. He had trouble making decisions, frequently second-guessed common everyday tasks, and began to isolate himself. He wanted to spend more time alone and would often lie down in the dark for hours.
I noticed in 2002, Sean started to fast a lot. He had no peace of mind at this point at all. And he felt that by fasting, he would regain some of that. But the only thing that happened was that he lost a lot of weight. He also became much more reclusive. He would make plans with his friends. He would cancel them very frequently. He also started dropping out of activities that he absolutely loved. For example, he had been, almost a lifelong musician, a drummer. And even when I met him, he was still very active in the music industry, and he just stopped. He said, no, God says I can't do this anymore. So anything he loved or anything that gave him pleasure, he felt he needed to give up. I was sad. He was an amazing musician. He was an amazing drummer. I mean, that's what he was known for, within our circles, both in and outside of the church. He was sought after for his drumming abilities. It was a skill he had honed, from childhood on. And, it was just sad to see someone feel that a gift that he had been given could not be used.
As time went on, the voices gained more control over Sean's thoughts and behaviors. Shortly before Sean turned 29, he heard the voices say that he would die on his birthday. These once happy events made him anxious and became impossible to enjoy. After 2003, Sean developed a paralyzing fear of air travel and refused to fly. At times, his fears extended to Doris. Believing she too would die while traveling, he attempted to prevent her from leaving.
I was giving these voices so much mental real estate that I almost completely crowded Doris out of the picture. I started canceling out on things that we had planned together. For instance, we had planned a trip to Germany to go visit her extended family. And I was so consumed with the thoughts of death again, related to flying. I had developed this phobia of flying that, and of course I erroneously believed that if I got on the plane somehow was going to be involved in this catastrophic crash and my life would end. So I said, I'm not coming to Germany. I was so convinced that she was going to die. So I begged her to stay, and she just would not subject herself to fear. She would not allow this illness to rule our home. And she said, no, I'm going. The next morning, I actually considered slashing the tires on her car to prevent her from dropping off the car at her parents' place, keep her from going to Germany. I wouldn't even help her with her luggage. And I mean, she just looked at me with this disdain. And she left. She went to Germany.
Our relationships with family and friends changed tremendously. I found myself more and more often attending family functions, both his family and my family alone. We were constantly canceling plans with friends because voices would tell Sean, not to go. This is not a good day to go, and so he would just cancel. So friendships basically dwindled.
Doris struggled when asked about Sean's change in behavior and appearance, as he forbade her from sharing details. She complied because she didn't want him to stress, as stress often worsened his behavior. She soon found herself lying to people, telling them everything was fine. Her relationships with friends, family, and Sean suffered greatly.
Our marriage was tremendously impacted. I think one of the hardest things that happened was, as a married couple, when you're going through something really tough, you can turn towards the other one and you can make that choice to be a team and to, work through it together, whatever the situation was. But in my case, I felt like I was losing my partner. And that loss was very painful. Someone I once talked to about it, she looked at me and she said, you know what? She says, you sound like a grieving widow, is what she said. And she was right. I didn't recognize the person I was living with anymore. He had become somewhat of a stranger to me. And that was just really, really hard. I didn't know how to cope with that loss. And I didn't know at that point whether I would ever get that back. And because Sean was just a shell of a person that I once knew. He didn't act like the person I fell in love with. He didn't talk to me like the person I fell in love with. He didn't enjoy doing the things he used to. It was just like someone else had replaced him.
In June 2003, Sean was hospitalized for 2 weeks at a Winnipeg hospital. It was his first hospitalization since he and Doris married. Doris soon realized the need for ongoing support from a medical professional. So in the fall of 2003, community psychiatrist and university professor Dr. Stuart Wakeman agreed to take on Sean as a patient.
When Sean was struggling the most with mental illness, I would have seen that as being in the moderate to severe range. Severe being, at immediate risk of suicide or some other dangerous kind of outcome. Sean wasn't there a whole lot of the time, but he was clearly more than moderate in that his thinking had become quite disorganized. He was terrified a great deal of the time. He was quite sick, and as I say, it started off thinking that he had severe obsessive compulsive disorder, but it became clear over time that he had some kind of psychosis going on as well. Sean had intense anxiety, and that is often, that's a common symptom of human beings in distress. He also had extreme guilt, which can be a part of depression. It can be an exaggeration or amplification of normal guilt that we would feel, and even perhaps part of a Christian faith or other belief system that you have guilt for something you've done wrong or left undone and you have to make amends for it. But that was not what Sean was experiencing. It was paralyzing guilt that he felt compelled to do things over and over again. As time went on, he lost his ability to actually observe himself doing that. And that is one of the common symptoms of psychosis, is the loss of your sense of self, the loss of that feeling of being connected and grounded to this moment, to your story, to life as you know it, which then produces a whole nother wave of terror, because it's like being totally in limbo and not being able to ground yourself, to orient yourself, to calm yourself down. Everything, it's like the law of gravity has been called off, you know. And so that more and more is one of the manifestations of the disturbance of the dopamine system in the brain, is that observing and grounding and orienting. It was quite awful actually to watch him go through that. He's a very bright and very motivated guy. And the terror was palpable working with him in some of the sessions. And I don't live with them. Doris, I think, lived through a lot of that terror, and Sean's family did as well.
By 2004, Sean had been diagnosed with psychosis, depression, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. As the diagnoses mounted, so did the destructive and compulsive behaviors.
At the beginning of 2005, Sean went to go see his psychiatrist, and they decided at that point that they would try eliminating some of the medications he was on or reducing some of the medications. And whatever the agreement was between the two of them, it ended up resulting in Sean abruptly going off of all of his medication. He was almost immediately becoming increasingly obsessive. He became very delusional. It became apparent this was a very poor choice. And so, in spite of all my pleadings for him to go back to the doctor just to, you know, kind of take another look at the medications and, you know, what they had decided upon, he absolutely would have none of that. And so I ended up, you know, during a very frightening, you know, psychotic episode that occurred in our home, having to call 911 and have the police take him away in handcuffs. And that was probably one of the worst days of my life. I was scared, I was frightened by what he was doing, what he did, and I was completely unable to communicate with him.
After Doris's call to 911, Sean was escorted by police to a nearby hospital and was admitted to the psychiatric unit. This was Sean's 5th and lengthiest hospital stay, and his physician diagnosed him with schizophrenia.
The physicians told me that they felt Sean's prognosis was very poor, that because he wasn't responding well to the medications they were trying to give him, that, you know, he probably would end up in a chronic care unit. They were questioning whether or not he would ever come home again. So, out of concern for me, they also suggested that I leave my marriage to make a better life for myself. I was a little bit surprised at that suggestion. I kind of wondered, you know, who they thought would take care of him if I was now out of the picture.
As doctors prepared to admit Sean to a chronic care unit, he found out that his 21-year-old cousin had suddenly died. His cousin struggled with schizophrenia and never received the right help. This death was a turning point for both Sean and Doris. Sean began to recognize the importance of allowing family and medical professionals to help him instead of resisting their efforts. He made a commitment to stick with the medication regimen instead of independently taking himself off as he had done in the past. Doris decided to forego the plan to send Sean to a chronic care unit, and instead he was discharged home after 3 months in the hospital.
I had long been concerned that, you know, just the whole lack of assessment, maybe we were missing something else physiologically. He didn't look well. He looked pale. He had dark circles under his eyes. Just not only was there, the symptoms from a behavior standpoint, but even physically, he looked sick. I could accept the fact that medications would be a part of the overall treatment plan for Sean. I had no problem with that. But what I stopped believing was that the medications would actually heal him.
In early 2006, Doris began reading some books by New York Times best-selling author and physician Dr. Don Colbert. While reading about the assessments and treatments he provided his patients, Doris thought perhaps Sean would benefit from seeing a professional like Dr. Colbert. She called his clinic in Florida and made an appointment for November 2006. Forced to confront an intense fear of air travel, Sean initially refused to go, prompting a visit to his psychiatrist, who increased the dose of medications Sean was taking. Despite the added medicinal support and encouragement from Doris, Sean experienced extreme inner turmoil while trying to decide between risking his life by ignoring the voices or obeying them and canceling the trip like he had numerous times in the past. Until they were both seated on the plane, Doris wondered if she would be traveling alone. Although she was able to breathe a sigh of relief, Sean wrestled with thoughts of looming catastrophe until the plane touched down in Florida.
When we landed in Florida, I realized that I was very much alive. And this was completely contrary to what I'd been hearing. The voices said that I would die on the way to Florida. Huge pivotal moment for me, because it was the first time that doubt was cast on the validity of these voices. The next day when we were in Dr. Colbert's office, it just got better from there. He said to me, or what I understood him to say, is that, this is a very treatable situation, and when I'm done with you, it'll be as though there was never a problem in the first place.
Board certified in family practice for over 25 years, Dr. Colbert practices anti-aging and integrative medicine and has been featured on the Dr. Oz Show, Fox News, and ABC World News.
Sean had a determination and he had a hope to be healed. And I knew if a person had determination and hope, he had the determination that he was going to do what he needed to do to be healed. And I knew that I had a plan. I knew I could help him, and I knew he had the hope and he had the faith, and he was going to a good church. And so I thought for sure I could help him. And I wasn't 100% sure he would be healed or he'd be totally restored, but I knew I could help him.
One focus of Sean's new treatment plan included diagnostic tests, specifically the comprehensive neuroadrenal test that can detect neurotransmitter and adrenal imbalances. Neurotransmitters are brain chemicals that communicate information throughout the brain and body and affect everything from sleep and weight to mood.
What the testing will do is not only establish what the biology, what that biochemical fingerprint is for that particular patient, but it'll go further than that. You can get a baseline, you can look at the patterns that you're dealing with in terms of your patient, what types of deficiencies may exist, what types of excessive amounts of a biomarker that's being produced. But we'll go a little further with what the test can do. If a patient is on, let's say, an SSRI, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, what will happen is when you employ the use of those tests, you can then measure or monitor the efficacy of that treatment. Because let's face it, a global treatment isn't as good as one that's really focused and really individualized to that particular patient.
The tests Dr. Colbert used in Sean's treatment were developed by the company Neuroscience. Neuroscience provides licensed healthcare providers with integrative clinical assessments in order to identify and target neurological and hormonal imbalances.
At this point, we had developed roughly 18 tests for neurotransmitters. Of the 80 or 100 neurotransmitters, which we still have to do. But I'm safe to say that we have tests available now for the major neurotransmitters, such as adrenaline, noradrenaline or norepinephrine, for dopamine, for serotonin, for GABA, for glutamate, just to name a few.
For Sean, it was revolutionary to see for the very first time what was happening in his body.
To me, I was exhilarated. I was so excited about this. It was the first time that I was able to see on paper what was going on with me and correlate that back to how I was experiencing life, how I was feeling.
And what I found is, in treating patients with mental illness, most doctors simply treat them with medications, but I like to look at the whole person and not just one area. So many people are just looking at the mind, but there's an amazing gut-brain connection. And we find that if we can get the GI tract balanced and identify the foods they're sensitive to, as well as improve the GI health with probiotics and with enzymes, as well as digestive aids, then we can help the patient so much better, because so much is interrelated in the body.
Homeopath and alternative medicine expert Bryce Wild is featured regularly on The Dr. Oz Show and on breakfast television in Toronto, Canada.
The brain-gut connection, entirely new space. It's a new type of science. We know it's there. We're learning more and more about it on a regular basis. The other interesting thing is that the guts have more neurotransmitters within them, more neurohormones saturating them than even the brain itself. There's more serotonin, the feel-good hormone that we know about that influences our mood, and dopamine, and these neurotransmitters called acetylcholine. They all infiltrate our guts. More, in fact, than our brain. A higher saturation exists right here in our abdominal cavity. So what we've learned recently, and this is as it relates to mental health and mental wellness, is that we've got two brains. One is in our skull, and the other one is in our gut. It's called the enteric nervous system. And what's really interesting is that when this is upset, this is upset. And when this is upset, this is upset. So they are firing, lots and lots of information and neuroconnectivity between them on every second of every single day basis. Nothing is disconnected, everything is connected. And when it comes to neurotransmitters and mental health, there's a huge, huge role to play, or the guts play a huge role, and making sure that's a healthy environment is imperative when it comes to mental wellness or mental health. The unfortunate reality is when there is a leaky gut situation, your intestines are slightly inflamed, and numerous reasons behind that, and then certain molecules that shouldn't pass the blood-brain barrier do, that causes the brain to start firing in ways that it shouldn't. That predisposes the individual, perhaps more genetically predisposed, to mental illness, to exacerbate or to have episodes. There are many foods that actually might exacerbate or make mental illness worse. Somebody suffering from depression, bipolar schizophrenia might exacerbate these conditions, and others, anxiety disorder, attention deficit disorder, the whole gamut and realm. I want you to think of these foods as foods that are unhealthy for every organ and system in your body, and they are the micronutrient deficient foods, the whites of the world, cakes, cookies. These are indefinitely lacking the micronutrients and vitamins that we all need. Pasta, the bread, they really are lacking. It's not the carbohydrate aspect, because there are complex carbohydrates, grains, whole grains, quinoa, cassia, millet, buckwheat, that we should be eating a lot more of. But the reason they're causing a problem is because they spike insulin, they are very, very high sugar, transit time, that is the time it takes to eat them, and then the time it takes for that blood sugar to raise in your body, actually has a hugely negative impact in your brain. It's too much too quickly. It frazzles the brain and nervous system. It also contributes to inflammation, which negatively impacts anybody, let alone those individuals in particular predisposed to mental illness.
See, these diseases generally share inflammation, because schizophrenia is generally inflammation of the brain. We put him on an anti-inflammatory diet and cut out his gluten as well as his casein. And then also we help to lower his nighttime cortisol using, again, natural means, which would help put him in that sleep that he needed so much, because so many of the schizophrenics simply cannot sleep at night. And then another big thing is exercise. He started an exercise program. And exercise is so important to burn off those stress chemicals at night, so it also helps to lower the nighttime cortisol levels.
The nervous system, whether we talk about the brain or the body, it's an integrated unit. That the nervous system is really the most important system in your body. It really runs the show. Yes, that's why the brain sits on top of the body. The nervous system runs the show. So I found it strange that we really do nothing for the nervous system. No doctor will ask you how your nervous system is doing. And we all have the misconception that the nervous system runs fine from the day we are born to the day when we are dying.
I haven't yet had this epiphany as to why we think the brain and nervous system is any different than the heart on the physical level. A liver that's compromised or has elevated liver enzymes should be deemed very similarly to a brain that may have some neurochemistry that's somewhat imbalanced, because there is so much through food, through nutrition and lifestyle to get the nervous system and the brain functioning more optimally, no matter what gene subset or predispositions you have.
About 4 months after seeing Dr. Colbert for the first time, I realized that the voices were significantly quieter. And it was almost like a switch was flipped. It was like, wow, I'm starting to remember what it feels like to be normal again, to not be hampered and controlled by what was going on in my head. So their power was incredibly diminished. And it was just like, I know, it was like I could discern between what was truth and what was a lie. Very exciting time.
There was more color in his face. That look that people often have when they're very medicated, when they just have that flat affect, it left. He now wasn't looking through me, but actually at me again when I spoke with him. And when we interacted, it just seemed like he was responding more to what I was saying. He didn't seem as flat emotionally anymore. I also noticed that, he had a new spark of hope. Dr. Colbert had provided him with the hope that he could recover. Whereas I think the years of listening to professionals saying, this is not possible, you'll have to somehow learn to live with this for the rest of your life, had really dashed his hopes and his spirits. And to have someone that believed in him, a professional that believed he could reach this ultimate goal of being well, really gave him a boost and the energy to make the changes that he needed to make.
But clearly, by following the blood tests that Sean was getting and adjusting the neurotransmitters with the supplements that he was getting through neuroscience, is that the right name of the company? He got better. We slowly weaned off the antipsychotics. Sean is not on antipsychotics. I don't see any evidence of that anxiety in the background that makes me go, well, I don't know, it's all that good. I don't see that anymore. I see him as being relaxed, and the new challenge is embracing his life without mental illness hanging over his shoulders all the time. It's quite a significant difference.
I do consider Sean to be fully recovered, and again, his prognosis for the future is very bright. Again, he's going to have to avoid gluten, he's going to avoid dairy, he's going to have to continue an exercise program, he must continue an anti-inflammatory diet. There is a strong genetic component. However, in Sean's family history, there was no family history of schizophrenia, but it could have been in his distant relatives he's unaware of. So because of the genetic component of schizophrenia, yes, he needs to stay on a good supplement program. He needs to stay on a good anti-inflammatory diet, especially avoiding the gluten and the casein, and a good exercise program. And he should be able to stay in remission forever.
I frequently say to the people that I see that medications are only 20% of the recovery journey. Now, I wish I could say that was a scientifically proven number, but that's my guesstimate over 30 years of seeing patients and seeing the role of medication. The other 80% is, what are you going to do to change yourself and to change the environment and the life that you're living? Now, the medication can be important gas in the tank to make the journey, but the medications aren't the journey. And I think in North America, we still have a lot of magical thinking about pills, and that a pill will fix you up. And my good news that's bad news is a pill will help, but a pill is not going to fix you up.
I think feasibility of recovery, and that is to reiterate the idea of getting back to a state of health, back to a state of balance, back to a state of optimal wellness, is extremely, not just extremely feasible, it should be the end game. It should be the goal in every case, whether it's schizophrenia through bipolar, unipolar depression, attention deficit, anxiety disorder, you name it. Often these individuals are born with predispositions, and then they manifest through life. By virtue of genetic predisposition. But that doesn't. Once again, the newest science suggests that although we are born with genes that may dictate in part our destiny, we can in fact manage, and to some degree, we can play a role in our own destiny, and that is what's most empowering. So I'd say to you this: most of the science, most of the drug therapies that exist within the world of pharmacopoeia, of conventional medicine, were only ever designed for the short to medium term. They're triage, and they're miracles. They save lives. In the instance of depressed that ultimately may want to commit suicide, a pharmaceutical drug, can actually bring them back so that they're no longer considering that option. It's just not the end game. It's not the end all and be all. So, the idea that anyone in any state of disease, in fact, we've learned this only in the last decade or so, as well as full-blown cardiovascular disease, that is to say, rampant arteriosclerotic plaque deposited to the interlumen of the artery lining, is reversible. The same thing with, dementias, same thing, our brain is neuroplastic. It can regrow connections. These individuals that have and/or are experiencing mental illness need more than a pill. They need more than simply, one practitioner to, touch base with on a monthly basis to discern whether or not their symptoms are controlled. They need a lifestyle. They need a health and wellness plan, and then coming back to a state of health, and that is to say beyond just symptom-free, is entirely feasible, entirely possible. And then again, that should be the end game. Get that team around you, and that's step one.
I think one of the important things that happened in working with Sean and Doris is that we weren't just treating an illness in a person, we really were treating the relationship as well. I'm now teaching that if you're not including the families with the patients that you're seeing, that's really malpractice. You are robbing the meaningful relationships from that patient and inadvertently supporting the illness, destroying the family and friendships and church communities and cultural communities, because they're all struggling to try to understand it and therefore to be helpful in it. And if we're not including them somehow, we're actually making the illness worse.
Looking back now, I cannot figure out at times how we made it. And people look at the situation and see hopelessness. She saw a future of promise. When people were saying the worst about my situation, she believed that she believed the best. When everyone else found reasons for her to run, she looked for reasons to stay. Her commitment to me was unshakable. There's nobody else on this planet, no other person today, that has demonstrated unconditional love like my wife has.
This has been a very long, difficult journey at times, and many points down the road I was advised, just get out of this marriage, get out of this relationship, your life will be dragged down with it. And yet there was just something inside me that I felt God would not leave us in this really dark place. And so in spite of, a number of crucial people not really believing in us and not really believing that we could overcome it, I decided to make that decision to stay. And I'm really glad I did. I think the recovery has been almost beyond what I had hoped for. He has really just come full circle. He's not exactly the same man I married, I would say. He's better. He has his confidence back again. When I met him, I fell in love with him. But there was still, I think, a piece of him that was still a bit broken from, that initial hospitalization. But I think now that he has gone through this whole healing journey, that part has also been healed. And I'm excited. We have an awesome future ahead. And I believe that what has happened to us can happen also for others.
When we see people's faces light up with hope, loved ones return to their families, return to work, to school, to the things they once enjoyed, when you see them regain some of that autonomy that has been stolen by the illness, you recognize, or we recognize, the power in sharing our story to change people's lives. You recognize the validity of this approach to optimal health. If it helps them to regain their lives, how could we not share hope?